They told us the math was settled. Plus 11 planetary systems, 400 years of recorded interstellar conflict, a database so full that our predictive models had correctly called the outcome of every engagement. Since the third Calorian expansion, down to casualty, percentages rounded to 2 decimal points. We knew how wars ended. Plus, we knew the moment a force fell below threshold cohesion. We knew the precise caloric depletion point at which a biological combatant's decision-making degraded past tactical usefulness. We had mapped every known species breaking point, the invisible line where continued resistance stopped being strategy and became simply noise, dying. Slowly, loudly. The Conclave called it the Finality Index, and the humans called it a dare. I know this because I was there. Because I was the one who filed the report declaring their battalion tactically eliminated at 614 Standard. Because I am the one who will carry for the rest of my career, and I suspect the rest of my life, the memory of what happened at 615. This is my record of it. I kind of am required, by the terms of my field commission, to remain objective. I'll try. The ridge, I think, smelled like burning wire. Plus, well, I know that's not a useful tactical observation. I know my job is sensor arrays and probability cascades and making sure the engagement models reflect current battlefield conditions in real time. I know the smell of the air isn't part of my operational mandate, but the ridge smelled like burning wire and copper, and something underneath both of those, something organic and sharp that our xenobiology team had classified in their reports as human sweat under sustained physical duress. And I cannot write this log honestly without mentioning it, because that smell was the first indication I had that something was wrong. Wrong is the wrong word. Impossible is closer. Let me start from the beginning, or rather, let me start from where I started, which was already the middle, because I didn't know there would be a story worth telling until I was already inside it. The battalion had been designated Asset Group 9 Foxtrot in our command database. 41 human soldiers. I'd attached to the Terran Expeditionary Force on loan to the Conclave's forward engagement strategy in Sector 7 Keth. Their actually assignment was classified as Supplemental Pressure Force, which is bureaucratic language for, we do not expect them to accomplish anything decisive, but their presence will complicate enemy logistics enough to be worth the diplomatic cost of having them here. That was the theory. They had been in the Dureth Ridge engagement zone for 11 days. And I had been observing them for 9 of those days since the assignment landed on my station, and my supervisor, Coordinator Hels, had handed me the data package with the expression she wears when she's handing someone a problem she doesn't want. Humans, she'd said. Not as an explanation. Basically, as a warning. I'd reviewed their files. Standard combat personnel. Mixed specializations. Some of what their military designates infantry, some engineers. Some a category labeled reconnaissance specialist that our translation matrix kept rendering as professional sneaker, which I eventually determined was incorrect but found privately satisfying. Their, commanding officer was a female human named Sergeant Yael Draken, age 31, documented service history spanning 9 years across 4 separate conflict zones. Her psychological evaluation used the word tenacious 4 times. Their medical evaluations used the phrase within acceptable parameters with the frequency of people who have stopped being surprised by things that should be surprising. I hadn't did all of this. I had filed it. I had begun, basically, the standard observation log, and then the Keth offensive had pushed through the Eastern Pass, and 9 Foxtrot had stopped being a supplemental presence and started being the only thing standing between the Conclave's forward, supply depot, and complete capture. 0544. The first thing I saw on the ridge that morning, and I need to be precise here because I was not yet alarmed, I was merely confused, was Private Hector Reyes, sitting against a blown-out piece of equipment, eating. Not ration bars, not for what it's worth. I compressed nutrient paste in the tubes their species seems to tolerate despite what I can only describe as a texture offensive to the dignity of biological organisms. He was eating something he had apparently cooked, like over a small fire. Look, in a battlefield. At 5:44 in the morning, with Keth artillery cycling up on the eastern slope, I ran a thermal scan to confirm I was reading the scene correctly. I was. There was a small fire. There was a container. There was Reyes, private. I'm first class, designated in our files as demolition specialist, secondarily classified stress cook, eating what my scanner identified as reconstituted protein formed into a flat disc, heated until the exterior layer achieved a specific crispness, consumed with visible satisfaction. I pulled up the Keth artillery projection models. Impact range in approximately 4 minutes. Dispersal pattern suggesting Reyes put the flat disc in his mouth. In my opinion, I looked at him. I looked at the models, which I looked at him again. He was looking, I guess, at the eastern slope, not away from it. Plus, at it, chewing, watching. The way you look at a thing you've already accounted for. I flagged it in my log with the notation behavioral anomaly. Observe further. Didn't yet understand that I'd be writing that notation 47 more times before 6 o'clock. The Keth forces had been built for this terrain. That was not a prejudicial assessment. It was a geological fact. Their homeworld's surface structure had shaped their biology toward low-gravity ridge navigation, longer limb ratios, distributed pressure points in their lower extremities, visual processing optimized for ranging across broken elevation. They moved through the Durath Ridge like it was furniture they'd arranged themselves. Our models had calculated that 9 Foxtrot occupying the central ridgeline would hold their position for approximately 9 hours before needing to withdraw to a defensible fallback point. That was day 1. By look, day 11, we had revised the estimate 6 times. Each time, the humans had done something our models hadn't accounted for. Not impossible things, like not spectacular things, incremental, irritating, cumulative things that individually looked like stubbornness and collectively looked like... I was still working on a word for it. Dat Helse had called it luck, which I knew was wrong. I had been considering the word spite, but it didn't have a satisfying translation into standard. 0551. Sergeant Draken appeared at the edge of my monitoring frame at 0551, moving along the eastern ridgeline in a crouch that looked easy and was not. I had. The joint stress readings, I knew what her knees were doing, and she stopped beside 2 of her soldiers at a position I had designated Observation Post Charlie in my maps. The position no longer existed as I had charted it. 3, days ago, a Keth strike had removed the rock formation that had made it viable. The soldiers' well had dragged debris into a new configuration. It was messier, which it was lower. It had quite a bit worse sight lines to the north. What it had, however, was a direct angle to a Keth equipment relay I hadn't noticed until. I overlaid Draken's position against the terrain and realized that she was not at Observation Post Charlie. She was at something new that didn't have a name yet. I assigned it Observation Post Charlie Prime in my log. Then I felt that was insufficient and changed it to Observation Post Draken, which I told myself was for clarity and not for any other reason. She crouched beside Private Osei, their reconnaissance specialist, and they exchanged words too low for my audio to catch. Osei nodded. He had, I think, a piece of equipment in his hands that I classified as optical enhancement tool. Modified. Modified being the operative word, because it no longer resembled what it had been 12 days ago. He had been rebuilding it in pieces using components from 3 different sources, 2 of which I was fairly certain came from Keth equipment he shouldn't have had access to. I had flagged that separately. Under acquisition method, unclear. The bureaucratic for what it's worth, version of I don't want to know. Draken looked at the eastern slope, by which he had the same expression Reyes had worn over his flat disc breakfast. That accounting for a thing expression, where the thing is large and hostile and she's already done the math and is now simply waiting for time to catch up to the answer she's already reached. Actually, she said something. One word. For what it's worth, Osei's mouth moved. Short, emphatic, possibly a number. Draken nodded and moved back along the ridge. At 0553. I noted this exchange in the log and marked it significance unclear and went back to the artillery projection models. The Keth began their advance at 0600 exactly. I've always respected the Keth for their punctuality. It is perhaps the trait I find most legible about them. They believe in the precision of time, in the communication value of doing the expected thing at the expected moment. An advance at 6 o'clock says, "We've assessed you, we've found you manageable, we aren't rushed." My models showed 9 Foxtrots defensive formation as of 0559, 23 soldiers in active positions, 18 confirmed operational, 12 in what, pretty much, I was technically required to call reduced combat effectiveness, which meant injured, exhausted, running on stimulant compounds and bad decisions and whatever psychological mechanism humans use to continue doing things past the point when they should have stopped. 41 soldiers, total. Well, 40. Corporal Davies had been evacuated on day 8 with a compound fracture that he had apparently been concealing for approximately 36 hours, which had caused the human medic, a small ferocious woman named Rourke, to use a quantity of profanity that overwhelmed my translation matrix's capacity to categorize it. I honestly had logged it as emotional expression, strongly negative, and moved on. 40 soldiers, or against a Keth advance I was modeling at approximately 200 combatants with artillery support. The Conclave's engagement doctrine for this scenario was execute tactical withdrawal to secondary position. I pulled up the withdrawal orders, which checked that they'd been transmitted to 9 Foxtrot's command channel at 0430 as authorized. They had been. I looked at Draken's position on my display. She hadn't moved toward the withdrawal corridor. Kir 601. I flagged this as non-compliance with tactical withdrawal order and began composing a follow-up transmission. The Keth advance came in 3 columns, as our models had predicted. Central pressure, flanking pressure left and right, artillery cycling in, support patterns designed to suppress return fire from the ridge positions. Clean, efficient. And the kind of advance that speaks to the certainty of the advancing force, a force that has calculated its opponent's position and found it wanting. What happened in the next 4 minutes is what I'll be writing about for the rest of my career, possibly the rest of my life, and I'd like to state for the record that my models weren't wrong. My models weren't wrong. My models had perfect information about known variables. The problem, it turned out, was the variables I hadn't known to include. Bum 602. The first explosion was where I expected no explosion, not on the ridge and not near the human positions. On the eastern approach, 60 meters behind the leading Keth column's advance position, in a section of terrain my models had designated confirmed clear. No asset presence. I stared at my display, checked the sensor readings. The confirmed clear section had just removed itself from existence in a manner consistent with a shaped charge. Specifically, a shaped charge positioned with deliberate precision to collapse the eastern approach's drainage channel, which I hadn't in my terrain files was the primary structural support for. The eastern approach dropped, not dramatically actually, not all at once. The ground folded in, slowly and then comprehensively, taking 12 meters of the Keth advance column with it into a newly created defile that my maps hadn't had yesterday, and now definitely had today. I sat very still. Plus, I thought about Osei with his modified optical tool. I thought about Draken and her one-word conversation at 5:53. I thought about the Keth equipment components I had filed under acquisition method, unclear. 6:03. I changed that notation. I changed it to acquisition method, supply raid, night of day 9, cross-reference, missing Keth engineering stores, report filed by Sector Logistics, believed unrelated. They hadn't stolen, actually, Keth equipment. And they had stolen Keth Demolitions equipment. They had spent 2 days learning how to use it. And they had basically spent the remaining time deciding exactly where to put it. The second explosion was where I also didn't expect an explosion, which at that point shouldn't have surprised me, but did. The right flank collapsed. Not from the explosion itself. The charge was too small for that. What it did was different. What it did was remove the rock shelf that the Keth right column was using as an approach route and replace it with a grade that their biology could deal with under optimal conditions, but not under current conditions with current equipment weight loads and current artillery support units trailing. The right column didn't stop. Sort of. They adjusted. Slower, messier, a different path. Directly into the field of fire for position observation post-Drachen. Ose was there. He had the sort of optical tool. He was not, I now realized, using it for observation. What Ose had built, over 12 days in pieces from 3 different sources, was a targeting system that had no business existing in a field modifications context. My scanner reclassified it twice while I was watching. It, to be honest, kept arriving at the same conclusion, a conclusion that had the flavor of a software package refusing to believe its own output. Yet the right column took casualties from a position they hadn't identified as armed. Look, they redirected. Into the center, where Draken was waiting. 6:08. I've a complicated relationship with the finality index. I believe in it. I still believe in it. It is mathematically sound. Plus, the model isn't broken. What happened over the next 6 minutes was not a refutation of the model. It was... I've been searching for the precise framing since I filed my initial report. It was a problem of inputs. Garbage in, garbage out, as the humans say. Or rather, correct data in, incorrect weighting in, which produces a model that's technically functional, practically useless because it's assigned the wrong probability to variables it technically included. The model knew 9 Foxtrot was tired. The model had correctly noted their injury rates, their supply depletion, their days without adequate rest. What the model had done, what I had done, as the operator, as the person responsible for waiting, was assign those variables the standard degradation values for sustained combat operations. Standard degradation, to be fair, assumes a normal distribution of will. I've 43 days of field experience with human soldiers, and I can tell you now, with confidence, with the specific confidence of a person who has been wrong in an instructive and career-altering way. There is no normal distribution. There is whatever Draken had, which was something else. 6:14. I filed the report at 6:14. 9 Foxtrot, 40 soldiers. Honestly, 11 days. Reduced to 12 effective combatants by my count. Cornered on a central ridge with Keth forces converging from 2 angles after the eastern approach had been partially recovered and the right flank column had regrouped with engineering support. I assessed their position. I ran the models. Engagement outcome, decisive Keth victory, and probability, 97.3%. Asset Group 9 Foxtrot combat effectiveness, below tactical threshold. Recommend withdrawal authorization be revoked and Asset Group status reclassified as lost. I filed it. And I notified Coordinator Helse. I noted in my opinion, the time, as I always do. 6:14, which Draken looked at the eastern slope. She said something to the soldier beside her, a big, quiet man named Corporal Wren, who had been shot twice in the last 4 days and had treated both incidents with the affronted irritation of someone who objects to being interrupted. He nodded. Plus, she nodded. So the 12 remaining soldiers of 9 Foxtrot looked at each other with an expression my translation software could not categorize, and that I am not sure had a name in any language I speak. Let me tell you what 12 soldiers look like, arrayed on a broken ridge, outnumbered 11-1, with one shared functioning artillery suppressor between them, 4 rifles in need of maintenance, a demolitions specialist who had just spent his last shaped charge, and a reconnaissance officer carrying a weapon that technically shouldn't have worked. They look like 12 people, not symbols, plus not representatives of something larger. 12 people who are tired and hurt and angry about something I don't think any of them could have named clearly, who have decided, in the span of one collective look, to do something that my models have classified as tactically indefensible. I've watched a lot of battles. I've never watched one start from that expression before. The Keth advance was not expecting a countercharge. This isn't a criticism of the Keth, which in their position, with their sensor data, with the same probability models I had been running, they'd have had no reason to expect one. The math said no. Plus, the math said 12 exhausted combatants with depleted munitions would do the rational thing, which is recognize a conclusion that has been reached for you and behave accordingly. When the math said the engagement was over, what the math missed, what I had missed, was that humans do not appear to experience conclusions the same way we do. For most species, a conclusion is a fact, a locked door. You assess the lock, you assess the door, you determine your ability to breach it, and when the determination is insufficient, you go find another door. Draken hit like the lock with her shoulder. I want to be precise. This is a metaphor. She didn't do anything with a shoulder. What she did was far less poetic and far more alarming. What she did was order Private Reyes, the stress cook, the man who had been eating a flat disk of crispy protein while artillery cycled up at 544, to take the suppressor, move to the eastern exposed position, and make enough noise to anchor the Keth center column's attention. Reyes said something back and short. I caught TBH, it on audio. He said, "Beautiful plan, Sarge." She said, "Shut up, Hector." He was already moving. The thing about Reyes, and I want to be careful here, because I have a tendency when writing these logs to start assigning meaning to behavior that's simply behavior, to start building narrative structures around people who aren't narratives, they're people. The thing about Reyes is that he shouldn't have been operational. I am not editorializing. It's in the, I guess, medical file. He, in my opinion, had taken a grazing strike to the left side of his torso on day 7. The field medic, Rourke, had treated it, stabilized it, and in her medical notation had written ambulatory, field capable, cleared for light to moderate activity, running an exposed position against converging Keth fire while operating a suppressor that required two-handed stability. I had scanned the equipment's operation parameters in the first week of observation. Doesn't meet any known definition of light to moderate activity. Reyes ran it like he'd picked it out of a catalog. The Keth center column turned toward the noise. Here is the thing about the Keth center column turning. Here is the thing I was watching in my sensor data at 6:17, while simultaneously watching Reyes on visual feed and composing a second message to Coordinator Helsis, explaining that the situation had changed in a way I was still calculating, while also experiencing what I can only describe as a loud, insistent sensation in my upper body ganglia that I believe was something adjacent to the word dread, not for the humans, I want to clarify, but about them. About what it meant that they were doing this, about what it said that my model had been so comprehensively wrong. Here is the thing. The Keth center column turned toward Reyes. The Keth right column regrouped, pushing back up through the modified grade where they had taken fire from Osei, was focused on the ridge center. At the Keth Eastern Recovery Force, the column I had written off the Eastern Approach collapse as having neutralized, had extracted approximately 60% of its strength from the defile and was moving back toward the ridge from a southern angle, like 3 converging pressures. Reyes was anchoring, to be fair, the center, which meant Draken had a window, a small and closing window, on the eastern angle. I looked at my sensor data. I looked at where Draken was, and I looked at where the window was. She was not moving toward the window. She was moving toward Corporal Wren. Wren, who had been shot twice. Wren, who honestly was classified in my logs as reduced combat effectiveness. Wren, who was sitting against a piece of ridge equipment, looking at something in his hands with the expression of a person doing arithmetic. He held it up when she reached him. Kind of. I scanned it. Plus, my scanner considered several classification options and then settled. So without confidence, on improvised device, charge type, composition, uncertain, trigger mechanism, mechanical. Draken looked at it. She looked at him. She said something. He said something back. I had audio. He said, "It's probably fine." She said, "Probably." He nodded. She nodded. She took the device. And I need to stop here and explain something about the Eastern approach. When the first explosion, Reyes's shaped charge, the one I had been cataloging under acquisition method, unclear, collapsed the approach's drainage channel, it didn't collapse the approach entirely. What it did was take the structural load off the channel and redistribute it upward into the rock shelf above the defile. The rock shelf above the defile was, in my terrain file, listed as stable. My terrain file had been populated from conclave geological surveys conducted 18 months ago, that before the engagement zone had seen 11 days of artillery cycling from both sides. Stable is a, I guess, word that describes conditions, not materials. The materials had been changing for 11 days. Wren knew this. I know he knew this because when I cross-referenced his file with his service history, I found a secondary qualification listed in the appendix of his personnel record under additional training. Secondary, structural assessment, field certification, class 2. He was basically, in addition to being an infantry corporal who had been shot twice, a certified structural assessor. He had been looking at that ridge for 11 days. He had been doing arithmetic for 11 days. The thing in his hands was the conclusion. Draken moved east. 12 soldiers became 11 in visible position, one moving through terrain that my sensors were having difficulty tracking. She was low. She was using the broken equipment debris as cover, and she was moving with the kind of unhurried precision that looks slow until you realize how much ground has disappeared behind her. The Keth southern angle was 4 minutes from ridge contact. Reyes was still running the suppressor, and I do not know what was happening inside Reyes's body at this point. I know what sort of was happening inside his body at day 7, when I had the medical scan, and I know it hadn't improved meaningfully in 4 days. And I know he was operating a two-handed piece of equipment that required stability. I know he was doing this with a left side that had been described in medical notation as healing, rate, appropriate. He was making noise and deliberate, sustained, patterned noise. And I want to note this because it took me longer than I'd like to admit to recognize what he was doing, noise that sounded like defensive suppression fire but was arriving in intervals that didn't correspond to any defensive suppression pattern I had on record. It was irregular. Irregular in a way that was not chaotic. Irregular in a way that was, I eventually determined, designed to sound like multiple positions. He was making one suppressor sound like 5. The Keth center column behaved accordingly. The device was mechanical. Wren had said probably fine with the absolute conviction of a man who has done structural arithmetic and arrived at an answer he is confident in, filtered through the philosophical position that confidence and certainty are distinct categories, and he is in the business of the former. The shelf came down. Not all of it. TBH. Not spectacularly. Specifically, in look, the specific way that a Class 2 structural assessor who has spent 11 days looking at a ridge might arrange things to go, given the right encouragement at the right load-bearing point. A section collapsed that redirected the southern angle's advance path with the efficiency of a locked gate. In my opinion, the southern angle stopped. Plus, adjusted. Took 20 seconds longer than it would have. 20 seconds, I think. That Draken used in a way I am still analyzing and may continue to analyze for some time. She came in from the eastern side, on the Keth southern angle's flank. Alone, which I want to be clear about what she was doing because I think if I describe it without the framing, it will read as reckless. And it was not reckless. It was something much more uncomfortable than reckless. And because reckless implies miscalculation, and Draken hadn't miscalculated. She had calculated and arrived at this. She hit their communication equipment first. The field relay unit their column commander was using to coordinate with the Eastern Recovery Force. She hit it in a way that didn't destroy it but damaged it in the specific manner of equipment that appears to be operating, still cycling, still lighting, still transmitting, but is transmitting nothing useful. The Southern Angle's commander didn't immediately know he had lost coordination. He sort of spent 43 seconds, I've the timestamp, acting on his last received coordinates. In those 43 seconds, Draken was no longer there. What the Keth call tactical disorientation we translate as the moment when you know you're fighting something and you do not know what it is anymore. Their field manuals address it in the context of terrain confusion, signal disruption, or poor weather conditions. Their field manuals didn't apparently address the specific subcategory of you're fighting something that's small and damaged and should have stopped by the numbers and has decided that the numbers aren't the point. The southern angle held position and waited for coordination. The center column, responding to Reyes's multi-position suppression pattern, had spread its advance. The Eastern Recovery Force, 200 meters from the ridge, moving to rejoin, hit the terrain that Osei had been watching for 6 days with his rebuilt targeting system. Terrain that appeared clear because it appeared clear, because Osei had made it appear clear, while ensuring it was several other things also. I actually watched it on my sensor array, and the thing I kept thinking, the thing I could not stop thinking, and which I'll not include in the official report because it's no tactical relevance, but I am including in this log because this log is mine and I am going to be honest, was, they knew we were watching. They knew the conclave was observing, which they knew there were sensor arrays. They knew someone was running models and compiling data and making assessments. They had given us correct information. Every variable we tracked had been accurate. They had just arranged the variables so that the model would weight them wrong. The engagement window closed at 7:02 when Keth Command issued a general consolidation order, pulling all 3 columns back to the 200-meter line to reassess the situation. This is a standard Keth tactical response to information uncertainty. When you do not understand what you're fighting, you re-establish your position, reintegrate your columns, and gather intelligence before re-engaging. It is a sound response. And it cost them 44 minutes. 9 Foxtrot used those 44 minutes in the way that any rational observer would predict a force that had just executed a successful delaying action would use them. They rested. Reyes made you know more flat disks. I know this because I was watching, and I know this because at 7:06, 12 minutes into the Keth consolidation period, my thermal sensors picked up a small fire at a position I had designated Observation Post Drachen. 1 disk. 2 disks. And I lost count. Rourke, honestly, the medic, said something with enough volume that I caught it on audio. I'll not reproduce it here. I'll simply note that she was not talking about the disks. Reyes said something back. She said something else. He handed her a disk. 7:44. I sent my revised assessment to Coordinator Helts at 7:44, the original report, the one I had filed, at 6:14, the one that said 97.3% decisive Keth victory, and the one that had reclassified 9 Foxtrot as lost was still in the system. I didn't retract it. I filed the revision alongside it with a notation that said, original assessment, technically accurate as of filing timestamp. Subsequent events indicate incomplete variable weighting. Recommend model review. Hels responded in 30 seconds, which is fast for Hels. She said, How? TBH. Not a question. A word she was saying because she needed to say something. I wrote back, I'm still working on that. I was. I am. 9 Foxtrot held the ridge at 0744. 40 soldiers had become 12, and 12 had held a ridge against 11-to-1 odds for 44 decisive minutes, and the Keth consolidation order meant that the Conclave's forward supply depot was still intact, which meant the secondary offensive scheduled for 9 o'clock still had its logistical foundation, which meant the chain of consequence extending outward from Durath Ridge into the larger operation, that everything that came after was different than it would have been. How TBH different, I was still calculating. 12 people, which one flat disk, 44 minutes. The numbers keep changing shape when I look at them.